Los Angeles, mid-1990s. The city had learned to live with tension like background noise. Helicopters at night, sirens before dawn, and the unspoken understanding that fame didn't make anyone safe. Tupac Shakur knew that better than most. He moved through rooms with confidence, but never ignorance. Power, he believed, was not volume, it was timing. And before this story truly begins, let me say one thing clearly, because stories like this only exist if people choose to hear them. We have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. Subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream. What follows is not comfortable, but it is unforgettable. The building didn't look special. No signs, no cameras outside, just a private hall rented under a fake name, far from neighborhoods that ask questions. Inside, 12 men sat around folding tables, boots resting on cheap carpet, laughter bouncing off the walls. They wore no robes. That was old theater. Power didn't need costumes anymore. They were comfortable, arrogant, convinced that history belonged to them. And when the door opened and Tupac walked in alone, the laughter doubled. They expected fear. What they saw instead was calm. Tupac didn't raise his voice. He didn't scan the room nervously. He simply walked forward, eyes steady, posture relaxed, like a man who had already measured every outcome. Someone made a joke about his music. Another mocked his politics. A third asked if he was lost. 12 against 1 felt funny, until it didn't. Because what none of them understood in that moment was that Tupac never entered a room by accident. He carried history with him. The Panthers, the prisons, the streets, the system. And as the clock on the wall ticked forward, minute by minute, the laughter began to thin. Not because of threats, not because of weapons, but because something far more dangerous was unfolding: awareness. And 8 minutes was all it took. The first minute passed, wrapped in arrogance. Chairs scraped the floor as one of the men leaned back, folding his arms, studying Tupac like an object that had wandered into the wrong room. Another laughed louder than the rest, the kind of laugh meant to dominate silence before it even formed. They believed intimidation required noise. Tupac believed the opposite. He stood still, letting the room reveal itself, reading faces the way he had learned to read streets. Quickly, accurately, without mercy. Someone asked him why he was there. The tone wasn't curious, it was mocking. Tupac answered calmly, his voice low, controlled, almost conversational. He said he wanted to talk about business, about influence, about how the country was changing whether they liked it or not. That made them laugh again. One man slapped the table and said change only happens when men like them allow it. Tupac didn't interrupt. He let the sentence hang long enough to rot. What the 12 men didn't understand was that Tupac had spent years sitting across from people who believed they owned him. Record executives, prosecutors, politicians, gang leaders, and police commanders. He had learned how power behaved when it felt secure. It talked too much. It underestimated silence. As 1 minute became 2, the laughter softened, not because they felt threatened, but because something about Tupac's stillness felt wrong. Then he spoke again, this time naming things he shouldn't have known. Cities, meetings, donations routed through churches and shell organizations. Names of men who were supposed to be ghosts. The room shifted. One man stopped smiling. Another sat forward, elbows on the table. Someone asked how he knew those things. Tupac didn't answer. He didn't need to. The first crack had formed, and the laughter that once filled the room no longer knew where to land. By the third minute, the room no longer sounded the same. The laughter didn't stop all at once. There was no dramatic cutoff, no movie moment, just a slow, embarrassed thinning, like smoke being sucked out through a vent. The men began looking at each other instead of at Tupac. That's how you could tell the power had shifted, not into fear yet, but into calculation. They were starting to wonder if walking in alone was the point. One of them tried to reclaim the energy. He stood, paced a few steps, and spoke in a rehearsed tone, half lecture, half threat. He said Tupac was a celebrity, a product, a mouthpiece for kids who didn't understand the real world. He joked that poets always think they're soldiers. Tupac watched him without blinking, like he was waiting for the punchline to land. When it didn't, Tupac spoke again, softly, and asked the man a question so specific it felt like a fingerprint. The name of a bank, a date, a transfer amount, and the city where it had been signed. The man froze mid-step. Not because he was frightened of Tupac physically. He wasn't there for that. But because the question wasn't random. It was evidence. It implied records. Paper trails. People who talked. The other men noticed the hesitation and instantly shifted into defense mode. One cleared his throat. Another muttered that Tupac was bluffing. A third asked who sent him. But the certainty in their voices cracked, just slightly, as if even they didn't believe what they were saying. Tupac didn't claim he had a gun. He didn't threaten anyone in the obvious way. Instead, he described the world outside that room. Reporters hungry for corruption stories, communities organizing, lawyers building cases, and a cultural tide that could expose old networks with new tools. He said something even sharper, that history doesn't need permission to turn. He let that sit there, heavy and unarguable, while the men realized the danger wasn't a confrontation. It was visibility. And that's when the room started to go quiet for real. Not out of respect, out of instinct. Because by minute 3, the 12 men understood something they hadn't prepared for. Tupac wasn't there to win a fight. He was there to make sure they couldn't hide the next day. By minute 5, silence had mass. It pressed against the walls, against the cheap tables, against the men who no longer leaned back in their chairs. Someone reached for a drink and forgot to lift it. Another man's knee bounced under the table, an unconscious rhythm betraying nerves he didn't know how to hide. Tupac hadn't moved from where he stood. He didn't need to. The room had come to him. One of the men finally asked the question that mattered. What did Tupac want? The tone wasn't mocking now. It was careful, negotiated. Tupac answered without raising his voice. He said he wanted them to understand the cost of being seen. He spoke about how the world was changing, how cameras were getting smaller, how files traveled faster than rumors, how movements didn't need permission slips anymore. He mentioned the names of people they had once trusted to keep things quiet, people who were no longer loyal, because loyalty dries up when fear finds daylight. A ripple went through the room when he said a name connected to law enforcement. Not a high-ranking figure, not a famous one, someone mid-level, forgettable, perfect for silence. Tupac described a meeting that had happened months earlier, down to the hour, the exit used, and the car parked outside. No accusations. Just facts. The kind of facts that don't belong to outsiders. One man whispered, "This is bullshit," but his voice shook. Nobody backed him up. Tupac paused then, long enough to let the weight settle. He said something simple, almost gentle, that hate survives best in darkness. And darkness was becoming expensive. He didn't promise consequences. He promised exposure. And that was when the laughter fully died. Because by minute 5, the men realized the room wasn't soundproof anymore. It never had been. And whatever they decided next, they would carry it with them long after Tupac walked back out alone. Minute 6 arrived with a realization none of them wanted to acknowledge. No one was in control anymore. Chairs that had been pushed back earlier stayed where they were. No one stood. No one challenged him. The men who had laughed first now avoided eye contact, studying the grain of the table as if answers might be carved into it. Tupac noticed everything. The way confidence drains quietly, the way power shrinks when it's observed. One man finally broke the silence with a question that sounded like defiance, but landed like surrender. He asked if Tupac thought he could scare 12 men by himself. Tupac didn't smile. He didn't argue. He simply said fear wasn't the goal. Consequences were. He spoke about how movements don't need armies when information moves faster than threats. He reminded them that reputations collapse not from attacks, but from receipts. Names, dates, witnesses, things laughter can't erase. Another man shifted in his seat and muttered that Tupac was bluffing again. But no one echoed him. That was the tell. In rooms like this, solidarity is everything. Once it cracks, it never fully recovers. Tupac pressed gently, describing how quickly a single leak could spread through activist networks, journalists, and legal channels. He mentioned families who had waited decades for proof, for validation, for a reason to reopen wounds the system had stitched shut poorly. By the end of minute 6, something irreversible had happened. The men weren't afraid of Tupac. They were afraid of tomorrow. Afraid of subpoenas disguised as routine questions. Afraid of neighbors asking why reporters were knocking. Afraid of realizing too late that silence had stopped protecting them. And Tupac, standing alone in the center of the room, understood that the fight was already over. The room just hadn't admitted it yet. Minute 7 didn't announce itself. It arrived the way decisions always do, quietly, after all the noise has failed. One of the men glanced at the door as if measuring distance, not to escape, but to understand options. Another reached into his jacket and then thought better of it, hand stopping halfway, fingers curling back empty. No one spoke. The room had learned restraint the hard way. Tupac finally moved, just one step forward. Not aggressive. Intentional. He said he hadn't come to negotiate or to plead. He came to draw a line between the past and what was about to happen next. He talked about artists being treated like distractions while movements were treated like threats, and how he had learned to be neither. He reminded them that culture doesn't knock. It enters, stays, and reshapes the furniture. The words weren't shouted, they were placed. One man asked, almost politely, what would happen if they ignored him. Tupac didn't answer immediately. He looked around the table and said the same thing he'd said before, but slower. Exposure costs less than protection now. He described the way a single document, once public, multiplies itself, screenshots, copies, mirrors, until no apology can catch it. He said that silence used to be a shield, but it had become a spotlight. By the end of minute 7, the decision had been made without a vote. No threats would be made. No insults thrown. No laughter returned. The men understood that escalation would only speed up what Tupac had already set in motion. The room had chosen the only option left, stillness. And in that stillness, something broke that couldn't be repaired. Minute 8 was the moment the room gave up pretending. No one laughed. No one spoke. Even breathing sounded too loud. The men sat frozen, not because Tupac had threatened them, but because every option they had relied on, intimidation, numbers, history, had failed at once. Power had slipped out of their hands without a fight, and that terrified them more than confrontation ever could. Tupac looked at them one last time and said something simple, almost dismissive. He told them they were late to a future that didn't need their permission, that the world they depended on was shrinking, and that hiding behind silence only worked until someone learned how to make silence visible. He didn't promise justice. He promised memory. And memory, he reminded them, outlives institutions. No one stood to block him when he turned toward the door. No one followed. No one said his name. The chairs remained where they were, the tables untouched, the men suddenly aware of how small the room felt without laughter to fill it. When the door closed behind Tupac, the sound echoed longer than it should have. It marked an ending none of them would ever admit happened. After he left, the men stayed seated for several minutes, unsure who should move first. They didn't discuss retaliation. They didn't plan. They understood, instinctively, that anything they did next would only confirm what Tupac had already exposed. The room had gone silent not out of respect, but out of recognition. And that silence followed them long after they finally stood up. The silence didn't stay in that room. It followed them out into parking lots, into phone calls that went unanswered, into meetings that suddenly felt exposed. In the days that followed, small things began to unravel, quietly, almost politely. A planned gathering was canceled without explanation. A mailing list stopped circulating. A donor pulled back, citing unwanted attention. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. The structure they relied on weakened, not through force, but through hesitation. Rumors moved faster than denials. Someone had talked. Someone always does. A journalist asked the wrong question at the right time. A clerk misfiled a document that had been buried for years. A name appeared where it shouldn't have. The men who once laughed learned that influence is fragile when it depends on invisibility. They had mastered intimidation, not scrutiny. And scrutiny had arrived without knocking. Tupac never spoke publicly about that night. He didn't need to. His words lived elsewhere, in lyrics that felt heavier, in interviews where he paused longer than usual before answering, in a calm certainty that unsettled people who preferred noise. Those who understood power recognized the shift. 8 minutes hadn't destroyed an organization. They had done something more dangerous. They had disrupted its confidence. Years later, some would claim the meeting never happened. Others would insist it was exaggerated. That's how silence protects itself, by pretending nothing occurred. But the laughter never came back the same way. And the room, wherever it exists now, remembers what happened when one man walked in alone and proved that numbers mean nothing when the future is watching.